Why can a man do absolutely everything right, be attentive, faithful, generous, available every single time she needs him, prove with actions that he loves her, and still watch that spark in her eyes fade away little by little, while another man who barely seems to make an effort gets her thinking about him for days on end without being able to help it? If you have ever asked yourself this question in silence, feeling like something does not add up, like there is a piece missing, you are not alone. This is one of the most common and most painful experiences men face in relationships, and it is almost never discussed openly because it challenges everything we were taught about love, commitment, and what it means to be a good partner. You are not looking at a coincidence or an unfair twist of fate or proof that you are not enough. You are looking at a psychological mechanism that has been running in the human mind since long before relationships looked anything like they do today. A mechanism almost nobody explains to you because it is uncomfortable, because it contradicts everything we were taught about love since childhood, and because it forces us to face something we would rather avoid. Affection and desire do not work the same way, and they are not built from the same ingredients. I want you to hold on to that idea, because everything I am about to tell you revolves around it. Affection is built with security, with consistency, with predictability, with the certainty that the other person will be there tomorrow just like they were yesterday. It is the steady presence that makes you feel safe, the reliable warmth that tells you someone has your back, the dependable rhythm of a life shared with another person. Affection is the foundation of long-term partnership, and it is essential. Without it, a relationship becomes unstable, anxious, and unsustainable. But affection alone does not sustain desire. Desire, on the other hand, feeds on something completely different. It thrives on novelty, on uncertainty, on the thrill of discovery, on the tension between closeness and distance. It is the spark that ignites attraction, the electricity that makes your heart beat faster, the pull that draws you towards someone even when you are not sure why. And confusing these two worlds, treating them as if they were the same thing, is exactly why so many people work hard inside a relationship and still feel the spark disappear without anyone having done anything wrong. They poured all their energy into building affection, into being dependable and available and consistent, and they assumed that desire would follow naturally. But desire does not follow from affection. It follows from something else entirely. I have spent time studying this subject. I have read research on evolutionary psychology, gone through work on social behavior, talked with people who went through this exact same frustration, and analyzed patterns that repeat themselves over and over across different contexts and cultures. The deeper I go, the clearer one uncomfortable truth becomes. Many of the things we were sold as the perfect formula for winning someone's love are, in reality, almost the opposite of what sparks desire. The advice to always be available, to always say yes, to never create conflict, to prioritize the other person's needs above your own at all times. This advice sounds noble. It sounds like what a good partner should do, but it inadvertently dismantles the very conditions that make desire flourish. I am not going to give you clever one-liners or cheap tricks to impress anyone in a conversation. We are going to walk through the psychological architecture behind attraction, why the brain values certainty and uncertainty so differently, why scarcity completely transforms how valuable a person seems, why other people's opinions weigh more than we admit in public, why a well-held silence can communicate more than 1,000 words, and why, by the end of this journey, giving up the constant need to please is exactly what attracts people most. Before we go on, stay until the end, because halfway through this video, I am going to tell you something that will probably contradict everything you thought you knew about why someone cools off, and you need to hear the full argument for it to make sense. Let's start with the idea that is hardest to accept. Security, on its own, does not create desire. Picture two scenarios. In the first one, someone texts every single day without fail, answers every message instantly, is available at any hour, never sets a boundary, never says no, never shows a life of their own beyond the relationship. In the second scenario, there is someone whose communication is not constant, someone with their own schedule, with projects, with moments when they simply are not available because they are busy living their own life. And when they do show up, they do it with intention, not out of habit. Which of the two creates more intrigue? Most people, If they are honest with themselves, admit that the second scenario sparks more curiosity, more desire to know what that person is doing, more involuntary thoughts throughout the day. This does not mean the first person is worse or that constant availability is a flaw. It means the human brain processes the predictable and the uncertain in completely different ways, and that difference has an origin far older than it seems. For thousands of years, our ancestors survived thanks to an attention system that rewarded novelty over stability. What was stable posed no danger, but it also offered no new information, so the brain devoted few resources to it. What was uncertain, on the other hand, triggered a state of alertness and curiosity because it could mean either a threat or an opportunity, and it was safer to stay alert. That same circuit, originally designed for survival, is still active today, and it fires every time someone cannot fully figure another person out. This is not a flaw in human nature. It is a feature. It is the mechanism that kept our ancestors alive in a dangerous world. And it is the same mechanism that determines, in part, who we find compelling and who we overlook. And here is the trap so many people fall into without realizing it. When someone starts feeling interested, their first instinct is usually to eliminate all uncertainty as quickly as possible. They become completely predictable, completely transparent, completely available, convinced that this is how you prove commitment. The intention is good, but the result is usually the exact opposite, because that very gesture switches off the brain mechanism that kept attention alive. I am not saying you should play guessing games or disappear on purpose to provoke anxiety in the other person. That would be manipulation, and manipulation, besides being harmful, tends to show sooner or later and ends up destroying any real connection. What I am saying is different. A person with a life of their own, with projects, with spaces that do not revolve exclusively around the other person, naturally keeps that healthy element of uncertainty that pure affection, with no mystery behind it, cannot sustain on its own. Now, let's move to the second mechanism, one you have probably experienced without knowing it had a name. Scarcity changes how valuable anything appears, including a person. Think of any product advertised as limited, exclusive, or available only for a short time. Even though we rationally know that object holds no different value from a similar one without that label, the mind perceives it as more desirable simply because it is hard to get. This principle, widely documented in studies on consumer behavior, is not limited to material objects. It also applies to how we perceive the people around us. Someone who is always available, who never has other plans, who cancels any commitment the moment they are asked to, unintentionally sends a very specific message. My own time is not worth enough for me to protect it. Someone with a full life, on the other hand, who takes care of their time, who does not give it away carelessly, communicates exactly the opposite, and that difference translates directly into how their value is perceived. What is interesting, and I would ask you to pay special attention here, is that this is not about faking difficulty on purpose. Playing hard to get in a calculated way shows, and once it shows, it stops working because it starts being read as a strategy rather than a genuine trait of character. Real scarcity is not faked, it is built, and it is built by having your own goals that take up real time, friendships you actually maintain, personal interests you do not abandon for anyone. When that life is authentic, scarcity of time and attention stops being a trick and becomes a natural consequence of having an existence with substance. The third mechanism is perhaps the most uncomfortable one to admit because it exposes something about human social nature. Other people's opinion of someone directly changes how attractive that person seems to us. In social psychology, this is known as preselection, and it essentially works like this. If someone perceives that others value a particular person, they automatically assume that person must possess important qualities even before verifying it through their own experience. It is a mental shortcut the brain uses to save time and energy when assessing the social environment, a kind of indirect validation based on third-party behavior that we observe without consciously thinking about it. This explains why someone surrounded by solid friendships with a visible and genuine social circle comes across as more interesting than someone isolated, even if both have very similar personal qualities. This is not about faking popularity or surrounding yourself with people just to appear a certain way. It is about understanding that cultivating real relationships, keeping up friendships, Being part of communities and groups with shared interests not only enriches a person's life on its own, which would already be reason enough, but also indirectly communicates something valuable about who that person is and how they relate to the world. The Stoics understood this. They knew that human beings are social creatures and that our reputations matter. But they also knew that reputation is an indifferent, something that should not control our behavior. The key is to cultivate genuine connections because they enrich your life, not because they make you look more attractive to someone else. The fourth mechanism has to do with something that much of modern conversation has tried to eliminate entirely: mystery. We live in an era where we are constantly told that open communication solves everything, that you have to say it all, explain it all, clarify every thought, every emotion, every doubt immediately and without any filter. And although honest communication is absolutely necessary for any healthy relationship, there is an enormous difference between communicating honestly and exposing every single thought with no restraint at all. A large part of attraction happens outside of verbal language. It happens in a look held 1 second longer than expected, in a silence not filled with nervousness, in a gesture that suggests more than it confirms. When someone explains absolutely everything, they leave no room for the other person's imagination to take part. And it turns out imagination is one of the most powerful tools that exist for building desire. The brain enjoys completing incomplete information. When it receives an ambiguous fragment, it activates, generates hypotheses, comes back to that fragment later, analyzes it from different angles. That sustained mental activity is, to a large extent, what we feel as lasting attraction. If instead it receives all the information at once with no room left to wonder about anything, it has no unfinished business to work on. And without that unfinished business, interest fades quickly. And here is what I promise to tell you. What many people interpret as an unexplainable loss of interest is, in fact, usually the direct consequence of having unintentionally erased every trace of mystery. It is not that the other person suddenly stopped feeling something for you. It is that there is nothing left to discover, nothing left to wonder about, nothing left for the imagination to complete. And a bond with no room left for curiosity simply ends up feeling used up. The fifth mechanism is related to purpose and personal boundaries, and it is possibly the one with the greatest long-term impact, even though it is the least flashy in the short term. A person with their own goals, who holds on to their principles even when it is uncomfortable, who does not give up their identity or their values to please someone else, conveys something no single romantic gesture can match: solidity. That solidity earns respect, and respect, even though it is sometimes underrated next to immediate passion, is one of the strongest foundations on which lasting attraction is built. On the other hand, when someone starts constantly giving in, postponing their own plans, abandoning their principles, always saying yes just to avoid any friction, something paradoxical happens. Instead of creating more closeness, it creates a progressive loss of respect. The other person senses, often without meaning to, that this unlimited flexibility does not come from generosity, but from a need for approval. And the need for approval is one of those signals the human brain interprets, without us deciding it rationally, as lower value. Holding boundaries does not mean becoming rigid, cold, or distant. It means there are certain principles, certain spaces, and certain decisions that are not up for negotiation depending on someone else's mood. That calm firmness, with no need to raise your voice or prove anything to anyone, is exactly what communicates emotional autonomy, and emotional autonomy is enormously attractive, precisely because it is so rare. The sixth mechanism connects directly to everything we have covered so far. Imagination feeds desire far more powerfully than constant presence does. When a person is available all the time, with no space between one encounter and the next, the other person's mind never gets the chance to miss them, to project, to imagine what the next moment together will be like. Absence, used naturally and without manipulative strategy, not as punishment or as a control tool, but simply as part of having a life of your own, leaves a space that the human mind tends to fill with thoughts, with anticipation, with genuine curiosity. This does not mean disappearing on purpose to create anxiety, a practice that, besides being cruel, tends to be detected sooner or later and ends up damaging any bond of trust. It means understanding that desire needs oxygen, needs moments of natural distance to breathe and regenerate, the same way a muscle needs rest between workouts in order to truly grow. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of retreating into oneself, of having an inner citadel that no one else can enter unless you invite them. That inner life, that sense of self-sufficiency, is what gives you the strength to be present when you are present and to be absent without fear. And we arrive at the seventh mechanism, probably the most important of all because it sums up and sustains the previous six. Authenticity almost always beats the constant effort to please. When someone tries to please all the time, when they adjust their opinions, their tastes, the way they speak, and even their personality based on what they think the other person wants to hear, they are sending, without realizing it, a very clear signal. I need your approval to feel good about myself. That signal, however kind it may look on the surface, tends to push people away instead of drawing them closer because the human brain detects the need for validation as a form of low self-esteem, and low self-esteem rarely comes across as attractive, no matter how nice or accommodating the person carrying it is. By contrast, someone who shows their real personality with their own defined tastes, their own opinions, their own quirks, without a constant need for outside approval, conveys confidence, and genuine confidence, as opposed to arrogance, is magnetic precisely because it is so rare in a world where so many people shape their identity based on what they believe their surroundings expect from them. If you have made it this far, you are probably asking yourself a logical question. Does all of this mean you should stop being kind, stop being generous, stop taking care of the other person? The answer is no. And I want to make that absolutely clear before moving on. Kindness, generosity, and care are not the problem. The problem appears when those qualities are given without limits, without judgment, and without any life of your own behind them. Because then they stop being perceived as a conscious choice and start being perceived as a need for approval disguised as kindness. The Stoic virtue of justice demands that we treat others with fairness and kindness. The Stoic virtue of temperance demands that we do so with moderation and self-control. Kindness without boundaries is not virtue, it is self-abandonment. Let me tell you something that illustrates all of this pretty well. Imagine two people who meet someone on the very same day, in the very same place, under almost identical circumstances. The first one decides, from the very first moment, to devote all of their available attention, answering every message instantly, rearranging their entire week to find a free moment, and letting it be understood, without saying it in words, that this new person has become the center of their life. The second one, on the other hand, keeps right on with their routine, keeps their workouts, their hangouts with friends, their personal projects, and responds with genuine interest, but no urgency, letting the relationship grow at the same pace as the rest of their life, without pushing anything important aside. Over time, the same thing almost always happens. The person who received the overflowing attention starts to feel, without being able to explain why, that something is missing. While the person who kept their own center of gravity ends up generating more curiosity, more respect, and, paradoxically, more real emotional closeness. It is not magic or luck or a matter of who played their cards better. It is simply the predictable consequence of how human attention works when faced with certainty versus when it keeps a certain margin of uncertainty. Real transformation, then, does not consist of learning clever lines or memorizing tactics that can be mechanically applied to any situation. It consists of something much deeper and at the same time much simpler. Building a solid identity with purpose, with clear boundaries, with room for mystery, with a life that has meaning of its own regardless of whether anyone is watching it or not. When that foundation truly exists, every mechanism we have gone over stops being a technique you have to remember and apply artificially and becomes a natural consequence of who you are. You do not need to fake having a busy life if you genuinely have one. You do not need to fake boundaries if you genuinely hold on to your own principles. You do not need to fake mystery if you simply do not feel the compulsive need to explain everything right away. And here, perhaps, is the most important conclusion of this entire journey. Desire is not pursued directly. It is built as a side effect of a life well lived. The people who generate the most attraction are not the ones who study seduction manuals or memorize lines to impress someone in a first conversation. They are the ones who have invested time in becoming someone with substance, with their own direction, with firm values, and with enough self-love that they do not need anyone else to constantly confirm it. So, before looking for the next technique or the next piece of advice to seem more attractive to someone in particular, it is worth asking yourself a much more uncomfortable and at the same time much more useful question. What projects have I abandoned that I could pick back up this very week? What boundaries have I stopped holding out of fear of a small conflict? In what areas of my life have I stopped moving forward without fully admitting it while waiting for someone else to fill that gap for me? The answers to those questions, far more than any memorized seduction technique, are what end up determining whether a relationship stays alive over time or whether little by little it fades out without anyone quite understanding why. The next time you feel like someone is losing interest despite everything you are doing for them, instead of pushing even harder in the same direction, ask yourself whether the problem might not be how much effort you are putting in, but the direction you are putting it in. Because in the end, it is not total devotion or absolute availability that sustains desire over the long run. It is a complete person with a life of their own, with firm boundaries, with enough room for mystery, and with the inner security not to go chasing anyone's approval just to feel valuable. And if what you just heard made you reconsider even one single thing, it has already served its purpose. Not because you were going to change overnight, but because the first step toward building that solidity we have talked about throughout this whole video always starts the same way. Realizing where, without meaning to, you were giving away something that actually deserved to be protected. Epictetus taught that the first step toward wisdom is recognizing what is in your control and what is not. Your own life, your own projects, your own boundaries, your own character, these are in your control. Other people's interest, their desire, their choices, these are not. When you focus on building the life that is truly yours, you stop needing to chase anything. And that stillness, that groundedness, is what true attraction actually looks like. If you made it all the way to the end, comment "I made it," and I will reply to you personally. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of it and hit like if you enjoyed it.